Thank you very much. I'm going to be as brief as possible because we're running late. Ethics and ethics review of projects in DG Research has been a major preoccupation, and it has a history that is going back very much before most of you were involved in the Parliament and in the Commission. That was a few years ago, and it was in the last years of the 90s when I started working at the Council, and people started talking about clinical trials and the need for clinical trials and for the regulation of clinical trials as a driving facilitator for research and for the translational research. In the meantime, FP5 gave way to FP6. FP6 had already, as my colleague Jan van der Loo says, a huge number of clinical trials and translational research incorporated into its makeup, and FP7 continues in that trend. In my presentation, I was trying to give you an idea of what the general ethics environment in FP7 was, but in fact, from the end of the 90s, when the Council of Ministers requested during its Swedish presidency the inclusion of clinical trials, and particularly directed towards pediatric medicines, this gave a huge impetus to the whole situation. And they were first introduced in a larger scale in the FP6, as Jan has mentioned. The specific issues that were tackled in this period were, of course, the regulation and the good clinical practices, as well as the directive on clinical trials. This was a whole movement. It was very impetuous. The three great clinical trials, good medical practices, and the whole of the blood directive and the tissues directive was one of the things that came out of this. And of course, at all the moment, the clinical trials issue was coming back again and again, particularly from the ethics review, and what we could do to change this difficulty there was in regulating and in making sure that the clinical trials that were being conducted were going to be ethical and were going to be satisfactory to the citizen. Why ethics review? Ethics review ensures that the public money of the EU doesn't support research that isn't approved of by the European citizen, and it raises researchers' awareness about the ethical issues, which is, of course, the big path between and the big link between research and the patients. In fact, between society and research. The 7th Framework Programme and its decision in Article 6 sets the environment for the ethics review of projects, and the rules of participation again in Article 10. Next slide and the next. There are very few areas that are excluded from funding. Only research activities on human cloning, modification of the genetic heritage, except in cancer, and research activities intended to create human embryos solely for research projects. Those are not fundable by us, by the Commission. What is examined in the ethics review? Next slide. The ethical review panel discusses the following elements: whether the researchers respect the ethical standards, whether the relevant EU legislation and foreign agreements are taken into account. In the translational area, in the translational research area, of course, the main directives have been mentioned. It's the directive on clinical trials and good medical practices. At the moment, many of these of the areas in clinical research are not covered by specific legislation or regulation, but fortunately, these directives have been extendable to other areas. However, this basically requires a lot of streamlining, and of course our patient groups and our regulators are taking this into account, and I'm sure they're going to move forward very impetuously in the next period. It is very important for clinical trials to go ahead, particularly when there are extreme measures, and we've had a lot of patients groups mentioning this, and individual stories about the facilitating and the regulation of clinical trials for extreme measures, for people who are in a hopeless situation. That must be taken into account into the legislation. Clinical trials must be facilitated for extreme measures and for situations which are not standard. Cancer is not a disease that is standard, so clinical trials in cancer have to be treated in an unstandard way, whereas they still have to keep all the standards and all the safeguards that are in place for the normal and standard diseases. The awareness of the applicants for and the ethical aspects in our projects is particularly taken into account. The balance between the research objectives and the means to be used have to be taken into account constantly, and this is the next 3 or 4 slides. The main steps of the ethics review and the follow-up I'm showing you in a 4th or 5th slide from this one. It's the one with the arrows. One of the most important things is that the proposals which have included clinical trials have to be sent to a mandatory ethics review only when they have direct intervention, but the licensing and the requests of the competent local bodies have to be checked by the Commission. And here again, streamlining of the instances in which these competent local bodies issuing the licenses should be taken into account. And of course, this is the legislators and the patients groups that have to drive this whole process. The ethics review of clinical trials has a great incidence on the issues of consent. And the 2 crucial issues of consent are how the subjects contribute to science, how will the researchers protect the subjects and the data, and the financial benefit for the researchers, for the promoter, for humanity, and what will be the future use. These are the things that are constantly in the minds of our experts when doing the research, when doing the ethics review of our research projects. The ethics panorama for clinical trials and the focus on translational research. Applicants identify the key issues, and then they are taken forward into the project, and they are monitored by the scientific officers taking care of these projects. What are the issues that have a particular impact besides informed consent, data protection and privacy, and the research involving developing countries, of course, which is very important. Special sensitivity when children are involved. And of course, these issues are taken forward, particularly in our ethics review, which is carried out by Directorate Science and Society. Every time people are involved, informed consent and what the informed consent forms must contain is particularly important. We take this very seriously. We have a very robust ethical review, and we are looking forward to being able to contact more with the patients and with the researchers in order to drive this whole process forward. Thank you very much. I hope I was brief enough.